You're not sitting at this table. Not with that background. The sentence didn't just land. It sliced clean through the room, sharp enough to stop every fork midair and silence a 12-seat dinner worth more than most people's yearly salary, and Naomi Carter felt every eye turn toward her like she had just broken an unspoken rule written long before she ever walked through those doors. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't rush to defend herself, because the truth was, she had heard worse. And she had learned something most people in rooms like this never understand. Silence, when controlled, is power. The Whitmore estate stretched over 8,000 square feet just outside Greenwich, Connecticut, a place where wealth didn't shout. It whispered through imported marble, curated art, and the kind of lighting designed to flatter people who had never been questioned. And tonight, Naomi sat at the far end of that table in a simple black dress, no logos, no jewelry loud enough to announce status, nothing that matched the image Richard Whitmore believed belonged in his presence, which was exactly why he dismissed her. Across from her, crystal glasses reflected the tension building in the air, and beside her, Ethan shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty and fear, while his mother leaned forward with a smile that never reached her eyes. "We value legacy here," she said, her tone smooth but edged, "and we're very selective about who becomes part of it." A few quiet nods followed, subtle, practiced, the kind of agreement that didn't need words to reinforce itself. Naomi folded her hands gently on the table, posture straight, expression unreadable, her calm unsettling in a room built on quiet dominance. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here." Now, back to Naomi Carter. Richard lifted his glass slightly, as if the conversation had already been decided. "People like you don't build empires," he added almost casually, like he was stating a fact instead of exposing a belief. "You attach yourselves to them." And that was when the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the air felt heavier, like something unseen had just stepped into the space between them. Naomi's eyes moved slowly across the table, taking in each face, each expression, each assumption being made about her without a single question asked, and somewhere behind them, near the edge of the dining room, a young server paused, tray in hand, his gaze lingering just a second too long, like recognition was fighting its way to the surface. Naomi didn't acknowledge him. Not yet, because timing mattered more than reaction. Her phone rested quietly beside her plate, screen dark, presence subtle, but beneath that calm exterior, systems were already moving, conversations already happening far beyond this room. She had walked into this dinner knowing exactly what it was, a test, just not the one they thought they were giving. Ethan finally leaned closer, his voice low, almost pleading. "You don't have to stay for this." But Naomi gently placed her hand over his, stopping him, grounding him, not out of submission, but control. She turned her head slightly, her voice soft but precise. "I'm exactly where I need to be." And in that moment, something in her eyes changed. Not louder, not sharper, just clearer, like the room had finally come into focus. Because what they didn't know, what none of them had even considered, was that this wasn't just a family dinner, and Naomi Carter wasn't just someone being judged at the table. They were already sitting inside a decision that hadn't been made yet, one that would redefine everything they thought they owned, everything they thought they controlled, and most of all, everything they thought she was. The silence did not break after Naomi spoke. It stretched, slow and deliberate, like the room itself was waiting to see who would reclaim control first. And Richard Whitmore was not a man used to losing control, not in his home, not at his table, not in front of his family. So he set his glass down with a measured precision and leaned back slightly, studying Naomi as if looking harder might suddenly reveal the version of her that made sense to him. But it did not, because she did not fit into any category he respected, and that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "Confidence is one thing," he said, his tone calm but sharpened now, "but misunderstanding your place is another." A few quiet murmurs followed, the kind that reinforced hierarchy without needing to raise voices, and Ethan shifted again, tension tightening in his jaw as he glanced between Naomi and his father, knowing something was off but not yet understanding how far off it really was. Naomi did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, let them hang in the air where everyone could feel them, because she understood something they did not, that people reveal the most about themselves when they believe they are in control, and right now, every word they spoke was building a record they could not erase. Across the table, Ethan's mother lifted her napkin slowly, her movements controlled, elegant, practiced. "We are simply trying to avoid complications," she added, her voice smoother than Richard's but no less dismissive. "Families like ours operate on trust, on reputation, on alignment, and those things take years to build, not introductions over dinner." She smiled lightly at the others, as if the conclusion had already been reached, as if Naomi's presence was a temporary inconvenience that would resolve itself if handled correctly. Naomi's gaze shifted to her, steady, unflinching, and for a brief second, the older woman's smile faltered. Just enough to betray uncertainty before it returned, polished and controlled. At the far end of the room, the server who had paused earlier took a small step forward, then stopped again, hesitation written across his face, as if he was deciding whether recognition was worth the risk of speaking, because he knew something now, something that did not belong in this room yet. Naomi noticed him this time, just a glance, subtle, intentional, a silent acknowledgement that said not yet, and he froze where he stood, understanding without a word being spoken. Richard leaned forward again, impatience beginning to replace composure. "Let us be direct," he said, folding his hands on the table, mirroring Naomi's earlier posture without realizing it. "What exactly do you do, Naomi?" The question landed differently than the others, not curious, not open, but loaded, designed to expose, to categorize, to reduce her into something measurable that could be dismissed. Ethan exhaled quietly, almost bracing for impact, because even he knew that tone, that question, meant this was no longer about introduction. It was about evaluation. Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering him, not the question itself, but the intention behind it, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, precise, impossible to read. "I make decisions," she said, simple, controlled, and for a moment no one moved, because it was not the answer they expected, and more importantly, it was not an answer they could easily challenge. Richard let out a short breath, something between a laugh and a dismissal. "Everyone makes decisions," he replied, but there was a flicker now, something uncertain creeping into his tone. "That does not tell me anything." Naomi held his gaze unshaken. "That depends on who has to live with them," she said, and the words settled heavier than before, because this time, even the ones who had been quietly agreeing began to feel the shift, subtle but undeniable. Her phone buzzed again, soft against the table, and this time, Ethan noticed, his eyes dropping briefly to the screen before looking back at her. Confusion mixing with something else, something closer to realization, but not fully formed yet. Naomi did not check it right away. She let it sit, because timing was everything, and this moment was not about reacting. It was about allowing the room to walk exactly where it was headed. Outside, beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the evening had settled into that quiet, controlled darkness that matched the mood inside, and within the walls of a house built on legacy, perception, and control, something far more powerful was already in motion, something none of them had prepared for, because they believed they were the ones asking the questions, and they had not yet realized that Naomi Carter had already decided how this night would end. The room did not relax after Naomi's last words. It tightened, subtle but undeniable, like a pressure system building behind polished smiles and controlled gestures, and this time it was not just Richard watching her, it was everyone, because something in her tone had shifted from passive to precise, from present to inevitable. Ethan leaned back slightly, his fingers pressing against the edge of the table as if grounding himself, because for the first time since this dinner began, he realized he did not fully understand the woman sitting beside him, and that realization carried both admiration and unease. Richard cleared his throat, reclaiming the center of the conversation with a measured inhale. "Let's not turn this into something unnecessary," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "This is a family matter, not a negotiation." The word negotiation lingered in the air longer than intended, and Naomi caught it instantly, not reacting outwardly, but filing it exactly where it belonged. Across the table, Ethan's mother adjusted her posture, her smile returning with renewed effort. "We prefer clarity," she added, "and right now, there's a lack of it." Her eyes locked onto Naomi's, searching for something she could define, something she could control, but Naomi gave her nothing except calm, and calm in a room built on hierarchy felt like resistance. The server at the edge of the room shifted again, this time taking one careful step forward before stopping just behind Richard's chair, his grip tightening slightly on the tray he carried, because recognition had fully settled in now, and it was no longer a question of whether he knew her, but whether he should say it, and the weight of that choice showed in the tension across his shoulders. Naomi noticed, not directly, but enough, her awareness moving through the room like a quiet current, and she let it be, because timing mattered more than truth in moments like this. Richard leaned forward again, his patience thinning. "You said. You make decisions," he continued, his tone now edged with challenge. "So tell me, what kind of decisions put you at this table?" It was no longer a question, it was a test, one designed to force her into a position they could measure, and if necessary, dismiss. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper now, more focused, as if she had been waiting for that exact question to arrive. "The kind that determine who stays at the table," she replied, her voice even, controlled, and for a moment no one spoke, because the implication landed before anyone could process it. Ethan's mother's fingers paused mid-motion over her glass. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and across the table, one of the extended family members shifted in his seat, discomfort creeping into a room that had felt so certain just minutes earlier. Naomi's phone buzzed again, this time longer, more insistent, the screen lighting briefly against the white tablecloth, and Ethan saw it clearly now, the name flashing across it, not fully readable, but enough to register importance, enough to spark a question he had not dared to ask yet. Naomi glanced down, just for a second, then turned the phone face down without answering, her focus returning to Richard as if nothing had interrupted them. But the interruption had already done its work, because now the room knew something was happening beyond their control. Richard exhaled slowly, his composure rebuilding piece by piece. "You speak like someone with authority," he said, leaning back again, attempting to re-establish distance. "But authority requires proof." And there it was, the line he believed would reset everything, the demand that would force clarity on his terms. Naomi held his gaze, unblinking, her posture unchanged, but something behind her eyes had shifted completely now, not louder, not aggressive, just certain, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere far beyond this dining room. Outside, a car passed along the quiet street, headlights briefly illuminating the tall windows before fading into darkness. And inside, the silence stretched again, heavier this time, filled with expectation, uncertainty, and something else none of them could quite name yet. Naomi rested her fingertips lightly against the table, a small, controlled movement, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before. But it carried further. "Proof," she repeated, as if considering the word itself, then looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes one by one, not with defiance but with clarity, comes right before consequences, and this time, no one interrupted, because even without understanding why, they all felt it, the shift from conversation to turning point, from assumption to exposure. And somewhere between the silence and the next breath, the night began to change in a way none of them could stop. The word consequences did not echo, it settled, low and heavy, like something placed deliberately in the center of the table where no one could ignore it, and for the first time since the dinner began, no one rushed to respond. Not Richard, not his wife, not even the distant relatives who had been quietly reinforcing every assumption up to this point. Because something in Naomi's tone had stripped the moment of performance and replaced it with reality. Richard shifted in his chair, subtle but visible, his fingers tapping once against the polished wood before he stilled them, a habit of control returning as he forced a thin smile back into place. "You speak as if there is something at stake here," he said, his voice measured again, but the edge had changed, less certain, more probing. "This is dinner, not a boardroom." Naomi did not answer immediately, and that pause stretched just long enough to make the distinction feel irrelevant, because the room no longer felt like a family setting. It felt like something else entirely, something closer to evaluation, to exposure. Ethan watched her closely now, his earlier discomfort replaced by focus, because he could feel it too, the shift, the quiet unraveling of a narrative he had believed his entire life. And beside him, Naomi remained still, composed, as if she had already stepped outside of the moment and was observing it from a place no one else could see. Across the table, his mother cleared her throat softly, attempting to reassert control with familiarity. "We are simply trying to understand where you fit," she said, her tone lighter, but the intention unchanged. "These things matter in families like ours." Naomi's gaze moved to her again, steady, calm, and this time, there was something unmistakable behind it, not defiance, not anger, but clarity, the kind that does not argue because it does not need to. "Fit," Naomi repeated quietly, as if considering the word itself, and then she let it go, because it was too small for the moment that was unfolding. At the edge of the room, the server finally made a decision, stepping forward just enough to place a glass of water near Naomi's setting, his movements careful, controlled, but his voice, when he spoke, carried a subtle shift in tone that did not belong to staff addressing a guest. "Ma'am," he said, respectful, but deliberate, and for a fraction of a second, the entire table noticed it, the difference, the weight behind a single word, and Naomi met his eyes briefly, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them that no one else could fully interpret. Richard noticed it most, his attention snapping toward the exchange, because it disrupted the hierarchy he believed he controlled, and disruptions like that demanded correction. "That will be all," he said firmly to the server, dismissing him with a glance that was more about restoring order than service. But the damage was already done, because now there was doubt in the room, small but growing, and doubt spreads faster than certainty when it finds a place to land. Naomi's phone vibrated again, longer this time, the screen lighting against the table, and without breaking eye contact with Richard, she reached for it, her movements unhurried, intentional, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Ethan's breath caught slightly as he watched her, because something in the air shifted again, sharper now, closer to the edge of something irreversible. Naomi glanced at the screen, then answered, placing the phone lightly against her ear, her voice calm, controlled. "Yes," she said, nothing more, just one word, but it carried enough weight to change the room entirely. The voice on the other end was not audible, but Naomi listened, her expression unchanged, and after a brief pause, she nodded once, slow, deliberate. "Understood," she replied, and then she lowered the phone, placing it back on the table with quiet precision. Richard leaned forward slightly, unable to contain the shift any longer. "Is there something we should know?" he asked, his tone sharper now, because control was slipping, and he could feel it. Naomi looked at him, really looked this time, not as a guest, not as someone being evaluated, but as someone who had already seen the outcome, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but it carried further than anything else that had been said that night. "There is," she said, a faint pause following, just enough to let the room lean in without realizing it, "but you will not hear it from me first," and the words landed like a quiet warning, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable, because somewhere beyond that dining room, something had already been set in motion, something that did not require permission, did not require approval, and most of all, did not require belief. And as the silence returned, heavier than before, every person at that table began to feel it, the realization that this night was no longer unfolding under their control, and whatever came next was not going to ask for it. No one spoke after Naomi's last sentence, not immediately, because the weight of it did not invite interruption. It demanded adjustment, and for a room so used to controlling narratives, the sudden absence of control felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Richard's expression hardened slightly, not outwardly aggressive, but tighter, more calculated, as if he was trying to reconstruct the structure of the conversation in real time. "You are being deliberately vague," he said, his tone measured, but no longer smooth, "and in this house we value transparency." The word transparency landed with intention, a quiet attempt to reclaim moral ground, to reposition himself as the one setting terms. But Naomi did not react to the framing, because she recognized it for what it was, an attempt to define the rules after they had already changed. She rested her hands lightly on the table again, her posture unchanged, her calm intact, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same steady precision that had been reshaping the room piece by piece. "Transparency requires context," she said, "and context arrives on its own time." The answer did not confront him directly, but it removed his leverage entirely, and that subtle shift did more than any argument could have. Ethan watched closely now, his earlier uncertainty giving way to something sharper, because he could see it clearly, the way Naomi was not defending herself, not negotiating, not even participating in the dynamic the way everyone else was. She was allowing it to unfold while staying completely outside of it, and that realization unsettled him more than anything his family had said. Across the table, his mother's patience began to thin, the controlled warmth in her expression replaced by something firmer. "This is not a game," she said, her voice no longer soft. "We are trying to understand your intentions." And there it was, the assumption that Naomi's presence required justification, that her position at the table needed to be explained. And Naomi let that assumption sit for a moment, because it revealed more than any answer she could give. The server in the background shifted again, now fully still, no longer moving between tasks, his attention fixed on Naomi with a quiet certainty that contrasted sharply with the growing uncertainty at the table, and that contrast did not go unnoticed, not by Richard, not by anyone paying attention. Naomi's phone remained silent now, but its presence had already altered the atmosphere. A reminder that whatever was happening extended beyond the walls of this house, beyond the reach of the people sitting around this table, and that realization continued to grow, subtle but persistent. Richard leaned forward once more, his voice lower now, more direct. "Let me be clear," he said, abandoning the earlier politeness. "We do not make decisions based on impressions, we make them based on facts. So if there is something relevant to this conversation, now would be the time to present it." He believed this would force resolution, believed that clarity would return control to him, but he was operating under an assumption that no longer applied, that Naomi was waiting for permission to speak. Naomi looked at him, not dismissively, not confrontationally, but with a level of composure that made the entire exchange feel smaller than he intended, and when she responded, her words were measured, deliberate, impossible to rush. "Facts do not change based on timing," she said. "Only reactions do." And that sentence settled deeper than the others, because it shifted the focus away from information and onto consequence. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of his chair, the realization now forming more clearly, because everything about this moment felt less like an introduction and more like a threshold, something they were crossing without understanding what was on the other side. Outside, the quiet street remained unchanged, the world beyond the windows continuing as if nothing inside this house mattered. But inside, the atmosphere had shifted entirely, from control to anticipation, from certainty to unease, and no one could quite name when it happened. Only that it had. Naomi leaned back slightly, a small movement, but enough to signal that she was no longer responding, no longer engaging in the pattern they expected, and that absence of reaction forced the room into something unfamiliar, waiting, and as the seconds passed, that waiting began to feel heavier, more intentional, as if the next moment was not something they could create, but something they were about to receive. And for the first time that evening, Richard Whitmore did not have the next move. The waiting did not stretch forever, but it stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and in a room like this, discomfort was rare, almost unacceptable, because every detail, every word, Every glance was usually controlled, curated, predictable, and yet now, none of it felt stable. Richard Whitmore sat back slightly, his fingers steepled in front of him, a posture he had used in countless negotiations, countless boardrooms, a posture that usually signaled control, but tonight it felt different, less commanding, more defensive, and even he could feel it. "This silence," he said finally, his voice steady but thinner than before, "is not going to resolve anything," but the statement lacked the authority it was meant to carry, because the room itself had already shifted beyond his reach. Naomi did not respond immediately. She let his words pass through the space without resistance, because resistance would have acknowledged his position, and she no longer needed to do that. Instead, she turned her gaze slightly toward the far end of the table, where one of the extended family members had begun checking his phone. Subtly at first, then again, longer this time, his brow tightening as he read something that did not belong in this setting. It was small, almost invisible, but Naomi noticed, and more importantly, she knew exactly what it meant. Ethan noticed it too, his eyes following the movement, then shifting back to Naomi, searching her expression for confirmation, and what he saw there was not surprise, not concern, but recognition, as if the moment unfolding had already been accounted for. Across the table, his mother leaned forward again, her composure now edged with impatience. "If you have something to say, say it," she insisted, her tone sharper than before, because uncertainty was not something she tolerated well, especially not in her own home. Naomi looked at her calmly, her expression unchanged, and for a brief second, the contrast between them became unmistakable, one pushing for control, the other allowing it to dissolve. Then it happened again. Another phone lighting up, this time not just one, but two, then three, subtle vibrations against polished wood, screens glowing in the dim, warm light of the dining room, and with each glance downward, each shift in posture, the room began to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but in small, undeniable ways. Richard noticed it now, his attention snapping from Naomi to the others, irritation flashing briefly across his face. "Is there something more important than this conversation?" he asked, his voice firm, attempting to pull focus back to himself. But the question came too late, because the focus had already moved. One of the relatives cleared his throat, hesitating, then finally spoke. "Richard, there is something happening," his voice uncertain, almost reluctant, as if he was not sure how to introduce information that did not fit the narrative they had been building all evening. Richard's expression hardened. "What kind of something?" he asked, and the room stilled again, but this time the silence was different, charged, expectant, because now the shift was no longer invisible. The man glanced at his phone again, then back up. "Whitmore Holdings, it is trending," he said carefully, choosing his words as if each one carried weight, and in that moment, the temperature in the room dropped, not physically, but perceptually, because trending was not a word that belonged in private dinners, not without consequence. Ethan's breath slowed, his eyes moving between the speaker and Naomi, the pieces beginning to connect in a way he could not yet fully articulate, but could no longer ignore. Richard let out a short breath, dismissive at first. "That happens," he said, waving a hand slightly. But even he did not believe it entirely, because something in the tone, in the hesitation, suggested otherwise. Naomi remained still, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture unchanged, but now there was a clarity in her presence that filled the space more than any raised voice could have. Another phone buzzed, then another, and this time, no one ignored it, because whatever was unfolding had crossed from background noise into immediate reality. Richard leaned forward again, his composure tightening. "Show me," he said, and the man across from him turned his phone slightly, just enough for Richard to see the screen, and whatever he saw there did not match the certainty he had carried into this dinner, because for the first time that evening, his expression shifted completely, from controlled confidence to something far more dangerous, uncertainty. Naomi watched him, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with the quiet recognition of a moment arriving exactly as it was meant to. And as the silence returned, deeper and heavier than before, the room finally understood that whatever was happening was not random, not accidental, and most of all, not outside of Naomi Carter's reach. Richard did not blink as he stared at the screen, but the stillness in his face was not control anymore. It was calculation breaking down in real time, the kind of pause that happens when reality does not match expectation, and for a man who built his name on anticipating outcomes, that fracture was visible. The phone remained in his hand a second longer than it should have. Then he lowered it slowly, too slowly, like movement itself required effort now, and when he looked back up at the table, the authority he had carried all evening had shifted, not gone, but cracked. Enough for everyone to feel it. "This is incomplete information," he said, but the sentence lacked weight, because he did not believe it himself, and the room knew it. Across from him, the relative who had shown the screen swallowed hard, his voice quieter now. "It is not just one post," he added. "It is multiple analysts' finance pages, even internal chatter." He hesitated, then finished. "They're saying the deal is being delayed," and that word delayed landed harder than anything else so far, because it implied dependency, it implied exposure, it implied that something outside this house had the power to interrupt what Richard considered inevitable. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice low but focused. "What deal?" he asked, because for the first time, he realized there were conversations happening beyond him, beyond this dinner, beyond the version of his family he thought he understood. Richard did not answer immediately, and that silence was louder than anything he could have said, because hesitation was not part of his identity, not in front of his family, not in front of outsiders, and yet here it was, undeniable. Naomi remained still, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but now the center of the room had shifted completely toward her, not because she demanded it, but because everything else was beginning to orbit around what she had not yet said. Another phone lit up, then another, and this time no one tried to hide it, the quiet tapping of screens, replacing the earlier clink of silverware, the rhythm of the room changing from performance to reaction, and with each new notification, the certainty that had filled the table began to dissolve. Richard finally spoke again, his tone firmer now, almost forced. "Speculation does not define outcomes," he said, placing the phone down with controlled precision. "We have been through this before," but even as he said it, his eyes flicked briefly toward Naomi, just a fraction of a second, but enough to betray something he could not fully contain, doubt. Naomi noticed, of course she did, and she let that moment pass without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would have reduced it, and she needed it to grow. Ethan's mother straightened in her chair, her composure returning in fragments. "This is exactly why clarity matters," she said, her voice tight now, less composed than before. "We do not operate in uncertainty," but the irony of the statement hung in the air, because uncertainty was exactly what filled the room now, thick and unavoidable. The server in the background did not move at all anymore, his role completely forgotten, his attention fixed on Naomi with quiet understanding, as if he had already seen the end of this moment and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Naomi's phone remained still, but its presence had already done its work, and now the room itself was carrying the momentum forward. Richard leaned forward again, his hands pressing lightly against the table. "If there is something connecting you to this," he said, his voice lower, more direct, "now would be the time to explain it." And this time, the question was different, not dismissive, not condescending, but searching, because the possibility he had refused to consider was now too close to ignore. Naomi looked at him, her expression calm, her gaze unwavering, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried through the room with absolute clarity. "It already has been explained," she said, and the words did not challenge him, they settled into him, forcing recognition instead of argument. Ethan felt it then, fully, the shift, the realization forming not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable clarity, because everything about this night, every word, every pause, every reaction, pointed to something he had not allowed himself to see. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his composure holding, but only just. "Then say it plainly," he insisted, because now, more than control, he needed confirmation. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, the silence stretching just enough to make the answer feel inevitable, and somewhere between that silence and her next breath, the entire room leaned forward without realizing it, because whatever came next was no longer about perception. It was about truth, and truth, once spoken, does not return to silence. The silence before Naomi answered did not feel empty, it felt loaded, like every second carried weight that could not be undone, and when she finally moved, it was not dramatic, not sudden, just a small shift in posture as she straightened slightly in her chair, her hands resting calmly on the table as if nothing about this moment required urgency. Richard held her gaze, his expression fixed, but the tension in his jaw had deepened, because now he was no longer dismissing her, he was bracing for her, and that alone marked how far the room had already moved. Naomi's voice, when it came, was quiet, measured, but it did not hesitate. "The deal you are referring to," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "The one your company has been negotiating for the past 3 quarters. A flicker crossed Richard's face, subtle but undeniable, because she was not guessing, she was confirming. "The capital injection you need to stabilize your expansion into the West Coast markets," she continued, her tone even, as if she were reading from a report she had already memorized. "The one your analysts said would determine your valuation by the end of this fiscal year." The room did not move. No one interrupted, because now the information itself was doing what her silence had done before. It was taking control. Ethan's breath slowed, his eyes fixed on Naomi, the realization forming not in fragments anymore but as a single, undeniable line connecting everything that had happened so far. And across the table, his mother's composure faltered again, her fingers tightening slightly around her glass, because this was no longer about social alignment or family image. This was something else entirely. Richard leaned forward, his voice lower now, almost controlled through effort. "How do you know about that?" he asked, and the question was no longer rhetorical, no longer dismissive. It was direct, and it carried something new beneath it, concern. Naomi did not answer immediately, because the answer was not a statement. It was a moment, and moments like this required precision. Her phone, still resting beside her, lit up once more, the screen bright enough to catch the attention of those closest to her. And this time, the name was visible, not fully to everyone, but enough for Ethan, enough for the person sitting beside Richard, enough for doubt to become recognition. Naomi glanced at it briefly, then looked back up, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm authority that had been reshaping the room since the beginning. "Because I am the one who paused it," she said, and the sentence did not rise, did not sharpen. It simply landed, and in that instant, the entire room shifted completely. No one spoke, not because they did not understand, but because they did, and understanding arrived all at once, heavy and irreversible. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, his mind moving quickly now, recalculating, reassessing, searching for a way to reposition himself within a reality that no longer matched his expectations. "That is not possible," he said, but the words came out slower than intended, as if he was speaking them more to himself than to her. Naomi held his gaze, not challenging him, not correcting him, simply allowing the truth to remain where it was, because it did not need reinforcement. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now, almost careful. "Naomi," he began but stopped, because he did not know how to finish the question forming in his mind. "Not yet." Across the table, the relative who had first mentioned the trending news looked back at his phone again, then up, his voice barely above a whisper. "The investor, they are saying the investor is internal." And that sentence, simple as it was, closed the gap between speculation and reality. Naomi did not move, did not react, because everything that needed to shift had already begun to shift, and now it was simply unfolding. Richard sat back slowly, his composure not gone, but changed, reshaped by the weight of what he was beginning to understand, and for the first time that evening, he was not leading the moment, he was inside it, reacting to something beyond his control. Naomi's presence filled the room now, not louder, not more forceful, but undeniable, because what they had dismissed at the beginning of the night had become the center of everything by the end of this moment, and as the silence settled again, deeper than before, one truth stood clear above all others. This dinner was never about whether Naomi Carter belonged at the table. It was about whether the table could withstand her being there. The sentence did not echo. It settled, heavy and irreversible, and for a moment no one in the room moved because movement would have required denial, and denial no longer had space to exist. Richard Whitmore sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on Naomi, not with dismissal anymore, not even with doubt, but with calculation forced into overdrive. The kind that happens when a man realizes the ground beneath him has shifted without warning. "You paused it," he repeated slowly, as if saying it out loud might make it less real, but the words only deepened the reality they described. Naomi did not nod, did not confirm again, because confirmation would have been redundant. The truth had already anchored itself in the room. Ethan leaned forward, his voice lower now, more careful. "You are the investor?" he asked, and the question carried none of the earlier assumptions, none of the dismissal, only clarity forming where confusion used to live. Naomi turned her gaze toward him, softer now, but no less precise. "I am the decision behind it," she said, and that distinction mattered more than anything else she could have said, because it reframed the entire structure of power at the table. Across from her, Ethan's mother's composure fractured completely for a brief second, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again because there were no prepared responses for this version of reality. One of the relatives shifted in his seat, his voice breaking the silence cautiously. "If that is true, then the delay, the market reaction." He did not finish the sentence, because he did not need to. The implications were already unfolding in every direction. Naomi rested her hands lightly against the table, her posture unchanged, her calm absolute. "Markets react to uncertainty," she said evenly, "and uncertainty begins the moment decisions are questioned." Her words were not defensive, not explanatory. They were statements, placed with precision, each one closing a door behind it. Richard exhaled slowly, the first visible sign that the weight of the moment had reached him fully. "Why?" he asked, and the question was different now, stripped of arrogance, stripped of control. It was no longer about challenging her, it was about understanding what had already happened. Naomi looked at him, and for the first time, there was something deeper in her gaze. Not anger, not satisfaction, but memory, the kind that does not fade. The kind that builds quietly over years until it no longer asks for recognition. It simply exists. She did not answer right away, because the room needed to sit in that question, needed to feel it without resolution. Ethan watched her closely, something shifting inside him as well, because the woman he thought he knew had just become someone entirely different, someone operating on a level he had not seen. And now he was no longer trying to protect her from the room, he was trying to understand the room through her. Naomi's voice, when it came, was softer, but it carried further than anything she had said before, because decisions reveal more than intentions, she said, her eyes still on Richard. And tonight, I needed clarity. The sentence did not accuse, it did not attack, but it exposed, completely and without resistance. The server at the edge of the room finally moved again, not to serve, but to step back, quietly, respectfully, as if even he understood that what was happening no longer belonged to ordinary roles or expectations. Richard's fingers tightened slightly against the table, the only sign that control was slipping beyond recovery. "You set this up," he said. Not as an accusation, but as a realization arriving too late. Naomi did not deny it, did not confirm it. She simply let the statement exist, because truth does not need acknowledgement when it is already understood. Another phone buzzed, then another, and this time the reactions were immediate, eyes dropping, screens lighting, the outside world no longer separate from the room but fully connected to it. And whatever was unfolding beyond those walls was now shaping everything inside them. Ethan's voice came again, quieter, almost uncertain. "What happens now?" And that question, simple as it was, shifted the entire room one final time, because now they were no longer questioning Naomi, they were waiting for her. Naomi leaned back slightly, her expression calm, her presence absolute, and for the first time that evening, There was no need for silence to create tension, because the truth had already done that work. And as she looked across the table at every face that had once measured her, dismissed her, defined her without knowing her, one thing became unmistakably clear. The night was no longer about what she would reveal. It was about what they would lose when she did. The question lingered in the air, not because it lacked an answer, but because everyone in the room understood that whatever came next would not restore what had already been lost. Naomi did not rush to respond. She allowed the weight of Ethan's words to settle fully, because this moment was no longer about speed. It was about precision, and precision required stillness. Richard remained seated, his posture controlled, but the illusion of dominance had dissolved, replaced by something far more fragile: awareness, and awareness changes everything. "What happens now?" Naomi repeated softly, her voice steady, and for a brief second, it sounded almost reflective, as if she were considering not just the question, but the path that led to it. Then her gaze moved across the table, meeting each set of eyes one by one, not with judgment, not with anger, but with clarity that left no space for misunderstanding. "Now," she continued, "the decision completes itself," and the sentence landed, without force, but it carried finality, the kind that does not escalate. It concludes. One of the relatives shifted in his chair, his voice uncertain. "You mean the deal?" But he stopped short, because even saying it felt different now, heavier, like speaking about something already slipping away. Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the direction of the thought without confirming it outright, because confirmation was no longer necessary. The room already understood. Ethan leaned forward again, his voice quieter, more personal this time. "Naomi, you could still move forward with it, right?" And the question was not about business anymore. It was about possibility, about whether anything from before this moment could still be preserved. Naomi looked at him, and for the first time, there was something softer in her expression, not weakness, not hesitation, but recognition of what his question carried. And when she answered, her voice reflected that understanding. "I could," she said, simple, direct, and for a fraction of a second, the room seemed to exhale, as if a door had just reopened. But then she continued, "But decisions are not only about capability," and just like that, the brief sense of relief disappeared, replaced by something more grounded: consequence. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his composure holding by structure now rather than certainty. "Then what are they about?" he asked. And the question was no longer strategic, it was necessary, because without that answer, he had nothing left to anchor himself to. Naomi did not look away, did not soften her tone. She simply answered with the same calm authority that had carried her through every moment of the evening. "They are about alignment," she said, and the words settled deeper than any accusation could have, because it did not attack, it defined. Ethan's mother shifted in her seat, her voice returning, but stripped of its earlier confidence. "We were simply protecting our family," she said, and for the first time, it sounded less like justification and more like explanation, as if she was trying to reposition what had already been revealed. Naomi listened, not interrupting, not dismissing, because she understood something they were only beginning to see, that intent does not erase impact, and impact is what remains when everything else fades. She rested her hands lightly on the table once more, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but no less clear. "And I was protecting mine," she said, and the sentence did not rise, did not press, it simply existed, undeniable and complete. Another phone buzzed, louder this time, and no one ignored it, because the outside world was no longer separate from this moment. It was defining it. The relative who had been following the updates glanced down again, then up, his voice tight. "The reports are confirming it. The funding is officially on hold," and the words sealed what had already been understood, turning possibility into reality. Richard closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, then opened them again, because there was no space left for denial, only response, and even that felt limited. "Now," Ethan looked at Naomi, not with confusion anymore, not with uncertainty, but with something else entirely, respect forming where assumption had once been, and yet beneath it, there was also realization, the understanding that some moments cannot be undone, only learned from. Naomi stood slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the entire room once more, because now her presence was no longer part of the table, it was above it, beyond it, and as she looked down at the people who had measured her before knowing her, one truth settled into the space with quiet certainty: what happens next is not decided by what they say, but by what they already revealed, and as the silence followed her movement, deeper and more final than any before it, the room understood that this was no longer a negotiation, it was an outcome. Naomi's standing did not create chaos, it created stillness, the kind that forces every person in the room to confront what they can no longer ignore, and as she rose from her seat, the subtle scrape of the chair against polished wood echoed louder than any raised voice could have, because it marked the exact moment control left the table entirely. No one told her to sit back down, no one interrupted, because authority had already shifted, not through force, not through argument, but through truth revealed at the right time. Richard remained seated, but his posture no longer carried dominance, it carried weight, the kind that comes from understanding consequences too late to redirect them, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of performance. "You are walking away," he said, not as a challenge, not as a command, but as recognition, and Naomi turned slightly toward him, her expression calm, her presence steady. "I am completing the decision," she replied, and the distinction mattered, because she was not reacting to the moment, she was finalizing it. Ethan stood halfway, then stopped, caught between instinct and understanding, his voice low, uncertain. "Naomi, this does not have to end like this." And for a second, the room held on to that possibility, fragile and temporary. But Naomi met his eyes, and what he saw there was not hesitation, it was clarity that had already been earned. "It does not end here," she said softly. "It reveals here." And the sentence carried something deeper than explanation. It carried closure. Across the table, his mother shifted, her voice returning, but now shaped by realization instead of control. "We did not know," she said, the words careful, almost defensive, as if naming ignorance could undo what had been shown. But Naomi did not react to that, because she understood something they were only beginning to face, that knowledge is not the measure of behavior, perception is. She stepped slightly away from the table, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to create distance between herself and everything that had tried to define her without understanding her, and that distance spoke louder than any response could have. One of the relatives cleared his throat again, unable to hold back the question forming in the room. "Is there any way to recover the deal?" he asked, and this time, no one stopped him, because now they were all asking the same thing, just in different ways. Naomi paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, and when she answered, her voice was steady, grounded. "Recovery depends on alignment," she said, and the repetition of that word carried more weight now than before, because they finally understood what it meant. Richard's fingers pressed against the table, his composure holding, but barely. "Then tell us what alignment requires," he said, and the request was no longer framed as authority, it was framed as necessity. Naomi looked at him, not above him, not below him, but directly at him, and for the first time that evening, the dynamic between them was completely clear, not adversarial, not equal, but defined. And when she spoke, her voice carried no urgency, no pressure, only certainty. "It requires seeing clearly before you decide," she said, "not after." And the sentence did not accuse, it concluded. The server at the edge of the room lowered his gaze slightly, not out of submission, but respect, because even from where he stood, the shift in the room was undeniable. Ethan stepped forward now, fully, his voice quieter, but grounded in something new. "I see you now," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried sincerity, the kind that does not need elaboration, and Naomi held his gaze for a moment, acknowledging it, not with a smile, not with reassurance, but with recognition, because seeing someone is not the same as understanding them, and understanding takes time. Her phone buzzed once more, and this time she did not ignore it. She picked it up, glanced at the screen, then nodded slightly, as if confirming what had already been set in motion. She looked back at the table one last time, at Richard, at his wife, at everyone who had built assumptions before building awareness, and her final words were not raised, not sharpened, but they carried further than anything else spoken that night. "You did not lose an opportunity tonight," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. "You revealed why it could not stay," and with that, the room did not react it. Absorbed, because the truth does not need noise to be understood. It only needs a moment, and this one would not be forgotten. No one tried to stop her when she turned away from the table, not because they did not want to, but because something in the room had already made it clear that stopping her was no longer an option. Naomi's steps were unhurried, measured, each one carrying the same calm authority she had held since the beginning, but now it filled the entire space, not just her seat at the table, and as she moved toward the edge of the dining room, the silence behind her deepened, not empty, but heavy with everything that had just been revealed. Richard remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting flat against the table, his gaze fixed forward, not following her, not yet, because he was still processing the shift, still recalculating a reality that no longer aligned with the structure he had relied on for decades, and when he finally stood, it was slower than expected, not out of hesitation, but because control now required effort. "Naomi," he called, his voice firm, but no longer commanding, and she paused, just briefly, not turning immediately, allowing the moment to exist without rushing it, because even now, timing mattered. When she did turn, it was slight, just enough to acknowledge him without returning to the table, and that distance, both physical and symbolic, defined everything that had changed. "If alignment is the issue," Richard continued, choosing his words carefully now, "then alignment can be addressed," and the statement carried a shift from authority to negotiation. A man who had spent his life setting terms, now asking for them instead. Naomi held his gaze, her expression unchanged, and for a moment, the room leaned into that exchange, waiting to see if anything could be restored, if anything could still be negotiated. "Alignment is not adjusted in response to consequence," she said calmly. "It is revealed before it," and the sentence did not reject him outright, but it removed the foundation of what he was offering, because it made clear that what mattered had already been shown. Ethan took a step forward, his voice quieter. Now, more personal than before, "What would you have needed to see differently?" he asked, and the question carried sincerity, not strategy, the kind that comes when understanding arrives too late but still seeks meaning. Naomi looked at him, and this time, there was no distance in her gaze, only clarity, nothing more than what was already there, she said, and the answer was simple, but it carried weight, because it meant the outcome was never hidden, only ignored. Across the table, his mother lowered her eyes briefly, the first visible acknowledgement that something had been missed, not by accident, but by assumption, and that realization settled into the room with quiet permanence. Another phone buzzed, and this time the reaction was immediate, one of the relatives speaking before even looking up. "The board is responding, they're asking for confirmation," and the words brought the outside world fully into the moment, removing any illusion that this was still contained within the walls of the house. Naomi glanced at her phone again, then back at the room, her presence steady, grounded, as if nothing about this moment required urgency, because everything that needed to happen had already been set in motion. Richard stepped forward now, closing some of the distance, but not all, because even he understood that some distances cannot be crossed the same way once they are created. "If this is finalized," he said, his voice lower, more measured than before, "then say it clearly," and the request carried something different now. Not control, not challenge, but acceptance seeking confirmation. Naomi regarded him for a moment, not weighing options, not reconsidering, but allowing the moment to reach its natural conclusion, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, unwavering, final. "It already is," she said, and the words did not escalate, they settled, sealing what had already been understood. Ethan exhaled slowly, the realization now complete, not sudden, but absolute, because everything that had led to this moment pointed to a single truth. This was not a decision made in reaction to the evening, it was a decision confirmed by it. Naomi turned fully, then no longer facing the table, no longer part of the space that had tried to define her, and as she walked forward, the silence followed her, not as absence, but as recognition, because what had just happened was not a loss created in a moment, it was a truth revealed within one, and as the door at the edge of the room came into view, one final understanding settled into every person left behind. Some opportunities are not taken away, they're simply no longer offered once you show why you cannot hold them. The door did not close loudly behind Naomi. It closed with a quiet finality that carried more weight than any dramatic exit ever could, and as the soft click settled into the room, it marked the true end of something none of them had realized they were risking until it was already gone. Inside the dining room, no one moved immediately, not because they did not know what to do, but because every instinct they had relied on no longer applied, and for a family that had built its identity on control, on perception, on always being one step ahead, standing still felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. Richard Whitmore remained where he was, his eyes fixed on the space Naomi had just occupied, as if the answer to everything that had just happened might still be sitting there, waiting to be reclaimed. But there was nothing left to reclaim, only something to understand, and understanding does not arrive on command. Ethan stood near the edge of the table, his posture no longer tense, but grounded in a way it had not been before, because the moment had stripped away assumption and replaced it with clarity, and clarity, once seen, cannot be unseen. She was never asking to belong, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, and the words hung in the air with a different kind of weight, because they reframed the entire night in a way no one had considered at the beginning. Across from him, his mother sat still, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze lowered for just a moment longer than usual, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that arrives when you realize the standards you trusted were incomplete, and that realization, quiet as it was, began to settle into the room. One of the relatives glanced at his phone again, then slowly placed it face down on the table, as if disconnecting from the outside world could somehow restore the one inside, but it did not, because what had been revealed was not dependent on updates or headlines, it was already complete. Richard finally exhaled, a long, measured breath, and when he spoke, his voice was not the same as it had been at the start of the evening. It was steadier in a different way, less about control, more about acknowledgement. "We misread the room," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more truth than anything else he could have offered, because it did not defend, it did not justify it. Accepted. Ethan looked at him, then back toward the door Naomi had exited through, and something in his expression shifted, not regret alone, but understanding layered with it, because he could see now that this was not about a single moment, it was about a pattern that had revealed itself fully when given the chance. The server at the edge of the room quietly resumed movement, not hurried, not uncertain, but steady, as if the atmosphere itself had changed enough to allow normal motion again, though nothing about the night felt normal anymore. Outside, beyond the tall windows, the quiet Connecticut street remained unchanged, the world continuing without pause, and that contrast only made the shift inside more apparent, because while everything out there moved forward as expected, everything in here had been permanently altered. Richard walked slowly back toward his seat, not reclaiming it, but acknowledging it, and as he rested his hand against the back of the chair, he paused, just briefly, because even something as simple as sitting down no longer carried the same meaning it had before. "We did not lose her," he said finally, his voice calm, grounded. "We showed her why she could not stay," and the sentence settled into the room with quiet precision, because it did not shift blame, it defined consequence. Ethan nodded once, slowly, not in agreement alone, but in understanding, and that understanding carried forward, beyond the table, beyond the night, into something that would shape every decision after this one. The room did not erupt, it did not react dramatically, it absorbed, because the kind of truth that had just been revealed does not create noise, it creates change. And as the last echoes of the evening faded into silence, one final realization remained, clear and unshakable. Respect is not granted by position, it is revealed by perception, and once that perception is exposed, there is no returning to what you thought you had before.